June 19, 2026. Los Angeles. A podcast. Rio Ferdinand is sitting with Thierry Henry, one of the greatest forwards the game has ever produced. They are talking about intelligence. About football intelligence specifically. About the players and coaches who made Henry smarter. Ferdinand mentions a name. An old man. A Brazilian. Someone from Henry's early career. Henry stops. Without that guy, he says, I wouldn't have been able to understand what Pep was telling me tactically. I wouldn't have been able to. But that guy, I won't give you his name. Ferdinand presses. The name comes. Joaquim Francisco Filho, the Brazilian. Yes, that was my coach. Most people listening had never heard that name before. Thierry Henry, two-time French champion, Champions League winner, one of the best players of his generation, was describing a coach as the foundational reason he could understand Guardiola's system. Not Arsène Wenger. Not Gerard Houllier. Not Pep Guardiola himself. A Brazilian from São Paulo who spent 29 years in a French football academy that the world rarely talks about. And then Henry said the sentence that changes everything. If he didn't tell me that when I was 13, 14, I don't even know if I would have made the national team. This is the story of the man who built French football from a room in Clairefontaine. And of the question his story asks about who, exactly, creates a player. Clairefontaine-en-Yvelines, a small commune 45 kilometers southwest of Paris, surrounded by forest, built around a chateau. Since 1988, it has been the home of the Institut National du Football, France's national football academy, the most prestigious youth development center in Europe. The names that pass through its gates are, by this point, almost absurd to read in a single list. Thierry Henry, Nicolas Anelka, William Gallas, Abu Diaby, Hatem Ben Arfa, Blaise Matuidi, Paul Pogba, Presnel Kimpembe, Kingsley Coman, Kylian Mbappe. 7 starters in France's 2018 World Cup semi-final had been through the Clairefontaine system. 2 World Cup trophies, 1998 and 2018, and 1 European championship built in large part on what that building, those pitches, and those coaching sessions produced. The world knows the results. What it almost never discusses is the methodology, the specific philosophy of play that was installed in those players before they were old enough to be signed by a professional club. And what it has never properly discussed, until Henry said the name on a podcast in Los Angeles in June 2026, is who installed it. Joaquim Francisco Filho was born in São Paulo on October 27, 1940. He became a professional footballer at 16, played for clubs in Brazil, Venezuela, Portugal, and France, and retired in 1973 at the age of 32 after a final season at Toulouse FC in Ligue 1. Then he became a coach. And then in 1973, he joined the French Football Federation's academy. He stayed for 29 years. The first thing you have to understand about Francisco Filho's time at the French Federation is what France's football looked like when he arrived. In the early 1970s, France were one of Europe's forgotten nations. They had not qualified for the World Cup since 1966. Their domestic league was largely irrelevant on the European stage. Their youth system was patchwork and inconsistent, producing isolated talents, Michel Platini eventually, but without the systematic structure that turned individual gifts into collective identity. The Federation's decision to hire a Brazilian youth coach in 1973 was, by any reasonable measure, a gamble. There was no precedent for it. There was no blueprint. A man who had retired from playing in French regional football, who had come from a completely different footballing culture, was being asked to help build the foundational layer of what would become French football's golden era. What Filho brought with him was not a complicated system. It was a philosophy, built on 4 principles he had absorbed from his Brazilian football education, and then refined across 17 years of playing in 5 different countries. Balanced use of both feet, precise passing in tight spaces, spatial awareness, the ability to read where danger was before it arrived, and most importantly, an identity of play that was consistent regardless of the result. In his own words, documented across his time at Clairefontaine, it didn't matter if we won or lost, we had an identity. That last principle is the one that sounds simplest and is in practice the hardest to install. Because to make young players prioritize identity over result, to make them hold to a way of playing even when they're losing, requires a specific kind of authority and patience that most coaching environments never achieve. Francisco Filho achieved it. For 29 years, Thierry Henry arrived at Clairefontaine at 13 years old. He was fast, extraordinarily fast, and he knew it. In the Rio Ferdinand podcast, Henry described himself at that age with unusual honesty, like, I wasn't clinical. He was a speedster, a boy who could run past anyone, who used pace as the solution to every problem. One day in training, Francisco Filho approached him. "You can't use your speed today. I don't want you to beat anyone or do anything with your speed." Henry's reaction: "I'm looking at him, and I'm like, how am I going to play?" He said, "Figure it out. Do not use your speed." So now, suddenly, because he did that, that opened something in my head. Think about what that instruction actually required. It took a 13-year-old's most reliable tool, the thing that made him better than every other player in his age group, and removed it. Deliberately. Not permanently, not punitively, but to force the brain to find another solution. The other solution, in Henry's case, was positioning. Movement before the ball arrives. Reading where the space would be before it existed. The kind of intelligence that a decade later, Pep Guardiola would identify as the precise thing that made Henry able to play in his system when other forwards couldn't. Henry said it directly: "Without that guy, I wouldn't have been able to understand what Pep was telling me tactically. I wouldn't have been able to." Guardiola's system at Barcelona is one of the most complex positional frameworks in the history of club football. Henry could execute it because at 13 years old in a training session in Clairefontaine, a Brazilian coach had taken away his most obvious weapon and told him, "Figure out something else." But the speed drill was only the first instruction. The second one goes even deeper. The second exercise Francisco Filho imposed on Henry was this: "Jerry, I don't care. Nobody knew. It was me and him. Today, I don't want you to pass the ball back. You're a 9. You can't pass the ball back." Henry's words again. A private instruction. A rule that existed only between the coach and the player, known to nobody else in training. What does that instruction produce in practice? A center forward who has been trained from early adolescence to always find a forward solution. To always look for the space between lines rather than recycle possession backward. To occupy, as a trained habit rather than an improvised choice, the territory between the opposing midfielder, the central defender, and the space behind the fullback. Rio Ferdinand, one of the best central defenders of his generation, has described Henry's movement as impossible to track. Not because it was random, precisely because it was systematic, because Henry had been trained from 13 to always look forward, to always move into the gap that defenders are hardest pressed to cover. That movement was not Wenger. It was not even Henry himself, in the intuitive sense. It was the instruction of a Brazilian coach in a Clairefontaine training session, repeated until it became automatic. The word Henry uses in the podcast is important. He somehow put a little dilemma in my head where I had to think. The goal was not the specific exercise. The goal was the habit of thinking under constraint, of finding solutions where the obvious solution had been deliberately removed. That is not a tactical drill. That is the formation of a certain kind of football intelligence. And it cannot be installed in a 17-year-old preparing for a professional career. It has to be installed at 13 or 14 before the habits that come from youth football's instinct to survive have already calcified into automatic responses. Here is what makes Francisco Filho's story genuinely extraordinary, and what makes Henry's 2026 revelation matter beyond a single anecdote. During his 29 years at the French Football Federation's academy, Filho oversaw the development of players such as Thierry Henry, Eric Cantona, and Jean-Pierre Papin. Cantona and Papin were the generation before Henry, the players who carried France through the late 1980s and early 1990s. Different temperaments, different positions, different careers, but built in the same academy, under the same philosophical framework, by the same coaching staff that Filho was part of. Then came Henry's generation, and then the generation after: Matuidi, Pogba, Kimpembe, Coleman, Mbappe, who arrived at Clairefontaine at 11 years old in 2009, 15 years after Henry, but inside the same system, shaped by the same identity. The Grokopedia documentation of Filho's career notes that many academy products from this era, including later stars like Paul Pogba, Blaise Matuidi, and Kylian Mbappe, formed the backbone of France's 1998 World Cup and 2000 European Championship triumphs, as well as contributing to the 2018 World Cup success. 7 starters in France's 2018 World Cup semi-final had been through the Clairefontaine system. But almost none of the reporting on that team, across 8 years of analysis and retrospectives, mentioned the name of the coach who built the foundational layer of what they all shared. Francisco Filho left Clairefontaine in 2002 to join Manchester United as a youth coach under Sir Alex Ferguson, where he also served as an interpreter for 17-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo on his arrival at Old Trafford. He retired from coaching in 2005. He came back briefly to manage the Mauritius national team in 2017. He is, as of June 2026, 85 years old. When Henry said his name on a podcast, Joaquim Francisco Filho, the Brazilian. Yes, that was my coach. It was, for most listeners, the first time they had ever heard it. Before we reach the climax, I want to stop here and ask the question this story is building toward. In football, credit travels in a specific direction. The player scores the goal. The manager builds the team. The club signs the player. The agent negotiates the contract. Each of these figures has a name, a face, a public presence. The youth coach who spent a training session with a 13-year-old and told him, "Do not use your speed today," that person disappears. Their work is unverifiable to the outside world. It lives only in the bodies and minds of the players who received it, expressed years later in movements and decisions that the commentators describe as instinctive or intuitive when they are, in truth, trained. Arsène Wenger gets credit for the Henry who played at Arsenal, and deserves it. Pep Guardiola gets credit for the tactical version of Henry who played at Barcelona. These are real, legitimate, documented contributions. But Henry himself, on June 19, 2026, at the age of 48, sitting with Rio Ferdinand in Los Angeles, said something different. He said the person without whom none of that would have been comprehensible was a Brazilian coach in a French academy who worked with him before any of those managers ever saw him. Who creates a player? The manager who wins trophies with him? The academy that gave him his first professional contract? The club that paid £10 million for him? Or the coach who sat with him at 13 and said, "You can't use your speed today, figure it out?" Here is the detail that locks the whole story into place. When Ferdinand referenced Filho in the podcast and Henry stopped, he said, "I won't give you his name," before eventually saying it. The implication of that pause was significant. He had been talking publicly about football for 20 years. He had given hundreds of interviews. He had discussed Wenger, Guardiola, Ferguson, Deschamps, countless teammates, countless opponents. He had been analytical and detailed and honest about the influences on his career in a way that very few players are. And he had never publicly named Joaquim Francisco Filho. Not because he had forgotten. The pause makes clear he hadn't forgotten. He hesitated because it felt like a private thing, like something that lived between him and a coach who most of the world had never heard of and had never sought credit for what he had done. When he finally said the name, he said it with what the transcript describes as care. Joaquim Francisco Filho, the Brazilian. Yes, that was my coach. Not one of my coaches. Not a coach I had. That was my coach. The possessive is the whole story. In 20 years of public interviews, Henry had held this name close and only said it fully on a podcast in Los Angeles during a World Cup summer when someone who knew the name brought it into the room. Francisco Filho spent 29 years in a French academy. He never managed a professional club. He never won a trophy. He never appeared on a broadcast. He never gave a press conference. He retired from coaching in 2005. He was 85 years old in June 2026 when his most famous student finally said his name out loud. Go back to the beginning. Los Angeles, June 19, 2026. Henry saying the name he wouldn't give. In that moment, a story that had been invisible for 50 years briefly became visible. Not because Francisco Filho had sought attention, or because someone had written a book about him, or because a federation had given him an award. Because one of his students at the age of 48 was asked the right question in the right room and gave the honest answer. Without that guy, I wouldn't have been able to understand what Pep was telling me tactically. That sentence contains a version of football history that the trophies and the statistics and the transfer fees have never told. It contains a Brazilian coach from São Paulo who spent 17 years playing football across 5 countries and then gave 29 more to a French academy, installing a philosophy of play that produced World Cup winners in 1998 and 2018, that passed through Henry and Cantona and Papin and eventually reached Mbappe. Who creates a player? The answer, according to the greatest forward France has ever produced, is the man whose name you almost didn't hear on a podcast in Los Angeles 20 years after his last training session. The man who told a 13-year-old, "You can't use your speed today. Figure it out." Here is the question I want to leave you with. Football is very good at attributing credit to the visible figures, the managers, the clubs, the agents. But the foundational layer of every elite player's career is almost always invisible. An early coach, a school trainer, a parent in the garden. Who is the person in your life, in football or beyond it, who took away your most obvious tool and told you to figure out something else? Tell me in the comments. I think this is one of the most underrated questions in the game.